it's a pleasure to be with you. I graduated from SETECA's Doctor of Theological Education program in September of last year, and I am happy to have this opportunity to share with you all some of what I learned in my dissertation. But I also look forward to this opportunity to learning from you as we reflect together on issues that are important, vital to theological education in Latin America and in the world today. I would like to begin just saying thanks to Dr. Jonathan Armstrong and to the Aqueduct project for this opportunity. And I'd also like to say thank you to Matthew Derrick, who has done a tremendous amount of legwork pulling this discussion together and involving all of us. So we're very thankful. And I really do want to say thank you to each one of you who are making time to be a part of this discussion. For those whose primary language is English, I would like to ask your indulgence for just a minute while I say a word to my colleagues who understand English, but for whom Spanish is their first language. Y quiero decirles a mis hermanos hispanohablantes, quiero darles una bienvenida especial. Y así se dice, ¿verdad? Hispanohablantes.
Está bueno.
¿Así se dice? Hey.
Sí, sí, sí.
Voy armando mi vocabulario de a poco.
Hispanoparlantes.
Parlantes, ¿no? Bueno, quiero darles la bienvenida y una bienvenida especial y quiero invitarles, hermanos, si desean que puedan hacer cualquier comentario o pregunta en español, si les sea más fácil, o si en algún momento desean pedir aclaración del idioma, con toda confianza, les invito a expresarse. Y aunque la presentación se hará en inglés, la tesis se escribió en español y se escribió pensando en necesidades y realidades de América Latina. Así que quiero decirles a mis queridos hispanoparlantes que valoro en gran manera su presencia y su participación in esta discussion. So at the end of the presentation, we're going to have the opportunity for questions, and we're going to have the opportunity to reflect together and for commentaries and questions and ideas that you may have. But as I share, there are a couple of questions that I would like for you to be thinking about. One of the things that was very evident in my research is that Latin American higher education, as well as Latin American theological education, is very fragmented. Not only in the same country, but across the region. We're very fragmented. And this issue is relevant to the investigation because this fragmentation in higher education in Latin America and in theological education in Latin America weakens the quality of our schools, the quality of the schools in the region, and it poses all sorts of logistical challenges with regards to transfer of credits or recognition of what you may have studied in one school if you want to transfer to another school, or recognition of your professional credentials from one school or one country to another. So a question that I would like for you to have in mind as I talk and as we think together is, what would be some of the practical, educational, and missional benefits of strengthening the cooperation of theological institutions in Latin America? And I hope that some good ideas can come out of our conversation. What sort of cooperative strategies can you suggest? And beyond just the idea, what would that involve? What sort of challenges would these strategies imply if we began to work together in new ways as theological educators in Latin America in ways that strengthen what each school is doing individually, but also what we're doing together for the kingdom of God. So many of us have had the experience of getting lost in a big city. I don't know if you've ever been driving in a place where you maybe even can see where you want to go, but the road is so confusing or the road is so difficult that there seems to be no way to get there from here. There seems to be no way to get there from the place where you find yourself. My investigation has to do with a similar challenge that many Latin American schools face, and it's the challenge of achieving accreditation and achieving government recognition. How do you get there from here? In particular, this study, the dissertation, sought to identify viable pathways or viable paths towards the accreditation of distance theological education programs in Latin America, roads that will get you from here to there. And we talk about distance education or distance theological education broadly, but online education was the primary focus. But many of the findings and the recommendations are applicable to other distance models as well. Now, the importance of this subject was underscored by the fact that most theological institutions in Latin America today do not have either private accreditation or government recognition. Most schools are not accredited. Most schools are not recognized by their respective governments. There are some exceptions, but that's the common situation. And if this is the case for traditional face-to-face, bricks and mortar models of theological education in the region, accreditation and government recognition are even more challenging for innovative online programs and other models of distance education. So let's think together about why do we need to identify or create new paths to accreditation, new paths to government recognition? What are some of the barriers to accreditation of theological institutions in Latin America? Well, for some schools, accreditation is just not a value or a felt need. There may be a theological reason why a school is not particularly interested in pursuing accreditation. Accreditation for many schools in Latin America doesn't have an economic incentive like it does in the US. It's not tied to financial aid or government funding in many cases. And so there's not a burning need for many schools to be accredited. Another reality is that many Latin American schools, not all, but many, may not have the level of infrastructure, the level of development, the quality, educational academic quality that accreditation standards require. There's another reason. In some countries, government educational policy may be prohibitive. That's the situation in Guatemala, for example. Our seminary, CETECA, is accredited privately through ITAL, but is not recognized by the government. And there's a constitutional reason that we're not recognized. The Constitution of the Republic states that only universities that have been duly recognized by the government, duly chartered, can grant legally recognized and valid degrees. Well, that by definition leaves CETECA out because we're a seminary and not a private university. So our school has struggled with that over the years. How do we become recognized by the government within these particular legal parameters? And many other schools in other countries struggle with similar issues. And there's another issue that serves as a barrier to accreditation for many schools, and that's that sometimes accreditor standards may be outdated or do not adequately address new models like online education. That's the case for ITAL, the accrediting association that I represent. There's a felt need in ITAL and within other regional associations of ICET to do a better job with the accreditation of online education, because we realize that many of our schools have online and distance education models that our accreditation standards do not adequately address. So this is a felt need within ITAL, and it's one of the felt needs that led me to want to pursue this particular investigation. So just a little bit about the methodology. This dissertation was based on bibliographic research. And there's a methodological element that I would like to mention that was important, which is systems thinking, the type of systems thinking advocated by MIT systems scientist Peter Senge, author of The Fifth Discipline, author of Schools That Learn, has written much about learning organizations. Systems thinking is important to finding the solution that the investigation seeks, because it helps us to realize that theological education does not exist in a vacuum. Theological education, as it's practiced in each school, in each country, in each region of Latin America, doesn't exist all by itself, but rather forms part of a very complex system. So on the one hand, in a narrow sense, the investigation is seeking to accredit online theological education programs in Latin America. But from a systems thinking perspective, we realize and we're able to analyze the way that this localized concern has to do with much broader issues. Like, for example, higher education and theological education in a global, worldwide perspective. Also the globalization and the internationalization of higher education accreditation models and standards, and the way that those models and standards from other parts of the world may be very important and determinative in Latin America. Also, this has to do with worldwide trends and precedents in distance learning, and the accreditation of online programs. The way that's happening around the world is important for us in Latin America as we seek to address the same issue. And also the challenges related to quality assurance in cross-border provision of higher education. All of this has to do with the particular question that the dissertation addresses, which is the accreditation of online theological education programs in Latin America. So although this was written for a Latin American audience and dealing with a particular Latin American problem, the investigation recognizes that theological education in the region doesn't exist in a vacuum, but is part of this larger complex system. And the investigation and the recommendations are enriched by contributions and precedents from three global contexts that were found to be representative, not exhaustive, but important to the discussion. Latin America, the United States, and the European higher education area. And also the investigation was enriched by pertinent models, insights, and resources from Asia, from Australia, and from Canada. So the investigation was structured by a primary objective and a research question that mirrored each other, but both sought to identify what sort of internal and external factors, and we're talking about factors with relation to the program themselves, internal to the programs and factors outside of the programs, what types of internal and external factors would most increase the possibility of Latin American theological distance education programs in attaining private and/or government accreditation. So the investigation was also structured by specific objectives and specific research questions. And I'd like to share those with you and just give you an overview of the areas that were investigated and some of the findings. So the first specific objective had to do with identifying global precedents in the fields of academic accreditation and distance education, global precedents that are of particular relevance to the search for paths to accreditation for theological distance education programs in Latin America. So in keeping with this first objective, the investigation explored the way that higher education accreditation works in these three representative global contexts. In the United States and Canada, where the United States Department of Education and the Council for Higher Education Accreditation, CHIA, they exercise different but complementary roles in the quality assurance of higher education. Also in the European higher education area that unites 48 countries as the result of a process of convergence that began in 1999 and has been implemented over the past 20 years through the Bologna process. And finally, we looked at the way that accreditation works in Latin America, both regionally and nationally, and examined the influence that quality assurance in other parts of the world have had in Latin America. So the investigation began broadly, but as it goes forward, it becomes more focused in the way that each of these elements that are being considered in the broader analysis contribute to the search for ways that Latin American institutions attain accreditation and government recognition for their online and distance programs. As I reviewed the literature, what really came to the fore were some of the major challenges that online education presents for accreditors around the world in each of these global contexts and in countries all around the world. I'm going to mention several challenges just briefly. First, there's the need to adapt to the fact and the reality of online education and all that implies, that the paradigm shifts, they're a part of that. All the statistics demonstrate that online education is with us and it's here to stay. It is a new reality in global higher education. So accreditors that may have been hesitant in the beginning have had to come to terms with that and address this new reality. But not only legitimate programs have grown exponentially, there's also been an explosion of diploma mills, and this explosion of fraudulent programs offered online has convinced both private accreditors and government accreditors of the need to regulate. It's interesting to note that not only is there a proliferation of diploma mills, but there are also a tremendous number of accreditation mills. Each one of these very impressive names that are appearing on your screen are all bogus, phony organizations, very impressive, with very impressive acronyms, and many have names that were chosen to mimic legitimate accrediting organizations, but they are all phony organizations that have been created to certify or to validate, quote unquote, phony diplomas. So it's interesting to note there are many accreditation mills, and the ones that I have included are all accreditation mills that supposedly accredit online education. So this is another reason that governments and private accreditors have had to take this issue very seriously. It's interesting and sort of funny to note that anybody can buy an accredited degree online. Just as the proud owner of Chester Ludlow demonstrated when his dog's Master of Business Administration diploma arrived in the mail. That's a true story. The owner sent off for a diploma in his dog's name, and the dog is supposedly a graduate of Rochville University. But not only is this a phenomenon in the secular world, it's sad to note that there is also a market for fake Christian credentials. Not only are there diploma mills that sell ministerial credentials, Doctor of Theology degrees and whatnot, but there are also a large number of accreditation mills. These are phony organizations that supposedly accredit phony schools. So the American Accrediting Association of Theological Institutions doesn't exist. The Association of Accredited Bible Schools and all of the others and others that I could have mentioned are all phony. So this underscores the need that accreditors and governments have had to regulate in this area. What is quality in online education? What is quality in distance education? How can we distinguish a quality degree from something that is of lesser quality or something that is of no quality at all? Another important challenge that online education has presented to higher education accreditation worldwide is the need to contextualize. Accreditors have seen the need to contextualize their traditional values and their standards in the light of new educational realities. Online education has required contextualization because it has brought with it several paradigm shifts, a number of important changes that are in direct conflict with long-held values of accreditors and the assumptions that they have long held about academic quality. Judith Eaton, the president of the Council of Higher Education Accreditation, in 1999 wrote an important paper called Core Academic Values, Quality and Regional Accreditation, the Challenge of Distance Learning. This was a time when online education was already here. It was a thing, it was a phenomenon, it was growing, and accreditors were playing catch up, and there was a raging debate. Some were very much for this new thing, and others were very much against. And the debate, the question was, do we need to sacrifice our values, our quality, our standards to be able to accredit online education? Can online education even be accredited? This was part of the discussion at that time. So this paper that Dr. Eaton wrote has been programmatic in the move to contextualize traditional values of accreditation in response to the challenges of distance learning. In the paper, she lays out the contrast between the core values of regional accreditation in the United States, institutional autonomy, collegiality, shared governance, intellectual and academic authority of the faculty, the granting of degrees, a liberal arts education, and site-based and community-based education and learning. And she described the way that online education challenges each one of these traditional values, these traditional assumptions, and really in some cases turns it on its ear. For example, the case of intellectual and academic authority of the faculty. The online education has really changed the role of faculty in many cases by disaggregating, by what used to be the role of one faculty member now is done in some cases by a team, where in a traditional role, the professor would prepare his own course for online courses. In some cases, there are courseware courses that are bought and then taught, or there's a production team, or you have a production team where one person is the content expert and one person is the expert in pedagogy and one person is the expert in graphic design and all the different components of what goes into making an online course. And then you have another person who's the tutor who actually teaches the course. So all of this is just brought about tremendous shifts in the way that higher education is done, the changing role of the faculty in each of these areas. The last one, we've gone from a situation where location is important, being together is important, to study together, to work together physically in the same place, and online education has changed that in a way that the physical site is less important for groups of people who learn and who study together, and also for people who work together. So Eaton concludes in this article that it is indeed possible to accredit or to evaluate quality in online education and to accredit the best of those programs without sacrificing the values of accreditation. But she says it's important to contextualize the traditional values. And I'll just read what she said. Will accommodating distance learning in this manner destroy core academic values? If we are careful to honor the purpose associated with each of these values, we will not destroy them. In each case, as we modify standards to accommodate distance learning, we need to ask, are we sustaining the purpose that this core academic value embodies? So, final challenge that I want to highlight that online education has made evident and urgent for accreditors around the world is the need to cooperate. The challenges associated with fraudulent, but not only spurious, but legitimate online programs have brought to the fore the need for cross-border quality assurance and the need for cooperation among accreditors and across regions. And I'll just mention two ways that accreditors are doing that from the North American context. The regional accreditors of the different regions of the United States have come together in agreement of a basis of evaluation of online education. They all use a document that's called the Interregional Guidelines for Evaluation of Distance Education. And when they talk about distance education, they are specifically addressing online learning. And this is very important because you have in the States regional accreditors that are responsible for different parts of the United States, and they accredit institutions that are physically present in those different regions of the United States. But distance education and online education crosses those regions. And so what do you do with schools that are in one part of the United States that are offering their courses and their programs in another part of the States? How do you regulate that? How do you make sure that quality education is being provided? And how do you make sure that what's being offered is not fraudulent? Well, on the basis of these regional guidelines, there's a very important initiative called NC-SARA, the National Council for State Authorization Reciprocity Agreements. And the idea is that if your school is in one of the 50 states of the United States, there is governmental oversight of education for the whole country, but each state has its own oversight, its own Department of Education. And it would just be so difficult and prohibitive if a school in South Carolina, in order to offer distance education or online education in the rest of the 49 states, had to seek permission separately for each state. And so this platform, NC-SARA, what they do, it's a consortia of schools from all the different states, and they have agreed to adhere to the same basis of quality in online education, which is this document of the Interregional Guidelines. So the second specific objective, after a broader overview in the first chapters, I began to evaluate the degree and the ways in which the global precedents can serve as guides for the private and the governmental accreditation of theological distance education programs in Latin America. And I'll just highlight some of the things that I began to analyze and see as important. One of the major global precedents that was evaluated with regard to this second specific objective was the European educational reform, the Bologna process that led to the creation of the European higher education area. This is a major global precedent that is much bigger than the European Union itself. It involves 48 countries to date, thousands of higher institutions, and millions of students. And as I began to analyze that, there were 5 aspects of the European reform that seem to be particularly relevant to the accreditation of theological distance education in Latin America. The first thing that was found to be particularly important is that in the higher education, the European higher education area, there's a common qualifications framework. All of the countries have a common understanding, a shared understanding of what a bachelor's degree is, what a master's degree, what a doctoral degree is. This is important as we compare the European experience to the Latin American experience. A bachelor's degree in Guatemala and a bachelor's degree in Honduras and a bachelor's degree in Cuba or in Venezuela could be structured very differently. There was actually a study that compared the higher education system of Latin America by country and across the region, and that was demonstrated to be the case. The second aspect of the European reform that was seen to be particularly important was a competency-based orientation for evaluating learning outcomes and quality. Part of the European reform had to do with coming to a consensus regarding generic competencies and also specific competencies, graduate profiles for each university program. And as different higher education institutions across the European Union and across the European higher education area are working together on the basis of a common framework, they have freedom to have different programs, and each program is unique and has its, its particular emphasis and focus, but they are all responsible to work towards the same graduate profiles. So if you have a program that is training architects, the universities may structure their programs differently, but they are trying to form and to demonstrate in their graduates the same professional competencies regarding that particular field. So this is important for distance education because a competency-based orientation, it isn't necessarily tied to so many hours in a classroom. The importance is not necessarily face-to-face instruction. It's not necessarily how many hours were you in the classroom. What is important is being able to demonstrate the quality and the efficacy of the program on the basis of learning. Another aspect that was found to be very important is a strong emphasis on cross-border quality assurance in the European higher education area. There are common strategies and mechanisms and parameters that are designed to assure that as these countries in the region work together along common guidelines, that they at least aspire to and are trying to maintain a common level of quality, or at least a minimum level of quality. Another thing that was seen to be important is the European Credit Transfer and Accumulation System, the ECTS. This is relevant to distance education. It's relevant to online education because unlike the traditional Carnegie system that's been very important in the United States and in other places, it's been important in Latin America as well. The ECTS is a system of credits that measures academic credit in terms of time invested in learning activities and not seat time. Now, students, as part of their learning activities, they may have time in a physical classroom. They may have time of face-to-face instruction, but not necessarily. The ECTS system takes into account all of the learning activities that are involved in achieving the outcomes that have been proposed for the course and for the program. A fifth fifth reason that the European educational reforms are important for Latin America is because of a study called the Latin American Tuning Project. The Tuning Project, within the context of the European higher education area, is a project that helps the different countries to implement the educational policies that have been agreed upon. So all of the ministers of education, they come together and they make decisions, and then everybody has to go back to their respective countries and figure out, well, how do we make this a reality within our educational system? So the Tuning Project within the European context helps to implement the decisions that have been made. But in other countries of the world, the Tuning Project has sponsored, the European Union has sponsored, with local participation of governments and higher education institutions, has sponsored studies in different regions of the world. And the idea behind it has been to explore what would be the importance or the feasibility of the possibility, the value of implementing similar reforms within our region. So in that way, there's been a Project Tuning China, where they have explored the possibilities of the value, the feasibility of implementing similar reforms within the Chinese higher education system. There's been a Tuning Africa, and there have been two phases of the Project Tuning in Latin America, of the Tuning Project in Latin America, in which representatives of Latin American higher education, representatives, policymakers of the different Latin American governments, representation from every country, have explored together with their European counterparts, what would it look like if we did something like this in our respective countries of Latin America and in Latin America as a region. The two phases of this study have yielded broad participation. They have yielded voluntary implementation by different universities. They have said, we want to be a part of this. Have yielded emulation of the reforms by some of the governments that have said, we would like to take the initiative in doing something similar in our national education system. And the Project Tuning Latin America has also yielded a formal proposal for generic competencies. The idea is there's a consensus that every professional, every university student in Latin America, success as a student and success as a professional in today's world requires the students to have these qualities, these skills to be able to build from there. So there's a formal proposal for generic competencies and also a formal proposal for degree-specific competence profiles for the different university majors. And that has come out of the Tuning Latin America project. There's also been a proposal that is being voluntarily implemented in different parts of the region of a Latin American version of the European credit system. In this case, it's not called the ECTS, it's called CLAR. It's called the Crédito Latinoamericano de Referencia, the Latin American Reference Credit is what it's called. So we'll talk about that a little bit later. Now, from the US context, as we analyzed the importance and the relevance of these different global precedents, the importance of the regional guidelines was evaluated and found to be very important. Something that's significant about this document, it lays out 9 hallmarks of quality in online education. But the interesting thing is that the evidences of quality are the same evidences that you would look for in a traditional model of education. It serves as a precedent and a model for Latin American governments and accreditors. And this is what I'm pointing out that it's modality neutral. It looks for the same evidences of quality regardless of the mode of instruction. Quality in missions and purposes, institutional planning and governance, curriculum evaluation, quality of student and academic services. Now, here again, the standards remain the same. The need to show quality in each of these areas remains the same, but each of these has to be contextualized and rethought completely in the light of distance learning, in the light of online education. For example, the quality of student and academic services. How can a school that offers face-to-face instruction, but also offers online instruction, how can they provide the same access to the library or the same access to the different departments of the seminary to their online students who may never have the opportunity to be physically at the seminary? If it's a theological school, what will a seminary do for its online students with regards to chaplaincy care or pastoral care or spiritual nurture and development? So all of those things that traditionally have been thought about, how do we do it, or our best ideas and strategies have been focused on how to do this in a residential model, have to be completely rethought and in some cases reinvented as schools try to do and extend the same services to their online students. The third and the fourth objectives had to do with this: identify the external and the internal factors that most favor the accreditation of Latin American theological distance education programs. So we're becoming more and more specific. After this broader overview, we are really coming to where the rubber hits the road and identifying what are those factors that are going to be most helpful for Latin American theological institutions that offer online programs. They're going to be most helpful for these schools to achieve accreditation and recognition from their respective governments. So we, as I analyzed those and identified and interacted with those, the factors were analyzed and classified in three ways: as internal, external, or combined. The internal factors reflects those aspects of an online program that theological institutions can work to improve that directly impact the quality and the credibility, if that's a word, of their online offerings. It's a way that a school can invest internally to make their programs of a creditable quality. Things like educational philosophy practices, instructional design, evaluation of outcomes and competencies. The external factors are factors that are outside of the direct control of the school, and that includes things like government policy, accreditation standards. They're very important. Schools are, in many cases, bound by those factors, but they're not directly within their control. What sort of government policies would need to be in place? What sort of accreditation standards would need to be in place for online programs to be accredited in Latin America? And combined factors are those that may originate outside of Latin American theological institutions. It's not something that each school has invented for themselves, but they're tools that can be readily applied by these schools to improve the quality of their online programs. So I'll just give you a quick overview of what those are. The internal factors that favor the accreditation of Latin American theological distance education programs, the first one I looked at was educational philosophy and practices that promote online student learning. And so in this section, I explored some of the points of contact between the methodology of Paulo Freire, Jane Vela, the andragogical methodology of Malcolm Knowles, the social constructionist pedagogy that serves as the basis of Moodle. I emphasize the importance of a student-centered dialogue methodology where there's substantial interaction between the professor and the students in intentional and creative ways. Another thing that was highlighted is helpful for schools that want to strengthen the quality of their online programs is the backwards design model. Grant Wiggins and Jay McTee are known for this, but there are other authors also that have written helpfully about a backwards design process where you begin by identifying the learning outcomes. You think about, in this particular course, in this particular program, in this particular degree, what are the learning outcomes? What are the areas of knowledge and skill that we want to see formed in our students and in our graduates, and what are the ways that they should be able to use and apply what they've learned? In the second place, you think, well, if the students learned all that we have proposed and in theological education, it's even more complex because we are thinking holistically about education. We're thinking about areas of spiritual formation and character development. And so we have very broad ideals about what we're trying to achieve, or lofty ideals about what we're trying to achieve through theological education. Well, the second phase is, what would be the evidence of achievement? If our students are really learning in the way that we intend for them to learn, what would be the way to evaluate that and to see it? And so after identifying learning outcomes and thinking seriously about evaluation, only then do you begin to plan learning experiences and instruction. So this is a model that can be applied to not only online education or distance education, but to any instruction model. But something that is particularly related to online education that I found to be helpful and recommended is Jilly Salmon's 5-stage model. It's a model that has to do with instructional design for online courses. It's a model that helps instructional designers to think about the way that they're designing learning activities for online students. And it's sort of like a Bloom's taxonomy for online learning, where you are intentionally and creatively helping the students move from lower to higher and deeper levels of learning. So a second internal factor that I looked at was competency-based assessment as an indicator of learning and of quality. Now, I mentioned that in the European educational reform and in other parts of the world, competency-based education is very important. It's not new, but it is fairly new for theological education. Competency-based theological education is fairly new, but it's something that's very much being discussed. I've included a link for you here to a report that was produced by ATS of different educational models with the participation of theological educators that are involved in these different educational models. And these peer groups produced a report where they reflect on and evaluate different aspects of these different educational models with regards to accreditation and with regards to different things. One of the educational models that was explored is competency-based theological education. And here I have reproduced a graph where 3 programs are being compared. The Deploy program, there are 3 master's level theological education programs that are based on competencies. There's not necessarily any requirement for seat time. There may not be face-to-face instruction with the students, and that forms no part of the evaluation of the quality or the efficacy of the program. What is used to evaluate the program is the actual learning that can be demonstrated with relation to the outcomes that had been proposed. So there's the Deploy program at Grace Theological Seminary in Indiana. There's the Immerse program at Northwest Baptist Seminary in Canada, and the Kairos program at the Sioux Falls Seminary in South Dakota. You can see that each one of these programs is different. They have points of contact, but they also have differences in their methodology, differences in the way that they're structured in their technological platform. But the thing that all three have in common, and you can see this in the last row, is that all three of these programs have been accredited by ATS, and the Deploy program and Kairos program, the two programs in the States, have also achieved regional accreditation. So these are innovative models that have relevance to the accreditation of distance education in other parts of the world that are already being recognized and accredited by secular and also theological accreditors in the States. So this is from the website of the Immerse program, and I just mentioned this to show you they're seeking mastery learning. Immerse is based on the principle of mastery learning, a system in which students don't just complete assignments, they live out those assignments in the context of life and ministry, guided by a team of mentors. The students aren't necessarily in a classroom. As a matter of fact, they're not in a classroom, but each student is assigned an academic mentor, a ministerial mentor, and also an institutional mentor. The students work through a series of carefully crafted learning experiences designed to help them accumulate the knowledge, the skills, and the character that are required in pastoral ministry leaders. Now, this particular program is of interest to us in Latin America because Northwest Baptist Seminary will launch a Spanish language version of Immerse in 2019. It's set to begin in February with a group of students in Colombia. Now, with regards to external factors that favor the accreditation of these types of programs, I looked at cooperative strategies that strengthen the quality of online theological education. Now, in the dissertation, there was a section where we talked about the phenomena of unbundling and rebundling higher education and theological education. Now, to explain what that means would take more time than we have, but you are aware that in many aspects of life, it used to be that you could only buy things as a package, and now you can acquire each part separately. I flew back to Guatemala just a few days ago, and it used to be that on the airline, you got food and you got entertainment, you got peanuts and all the rest of it. And now, supposedly, the prices are better, but you pay for each specific service that you want to acquire. Well, the same phenomena is happening in many areas, and we could give many examples, but there's also examples of unbundling and rebundling in higher education. Institutions that used to be vertically integrated, students would typically begin and complete their studies there, and all the aspects of the educational program and all the aspects of the institutional program were done in-house. With the internet and the way that the internet has disrupted many aspects of society and just changed the way we do things, higher education has become unbundled. And you'll hear authors and thinkers and educational futurists who are talking about disruptive innovation, that they'll talk about not only the ways that higher education has already been unbundled, but the ways that it will continue to be transformed in the future. Now, with regards to the dissertation, The particular thing that interests me with regards to strengthening online programs in Latin America is or was to think about ways that we could cooperate together as institutions instead of each school by itself trying to reinvent the wheel. What are ways that we could share resources and outsource some services and do things together so that we could strengthen theological education across the board? The other external factor that I wanted to mention were accreditation policies that are compatible with online education. And the dissertation explores two of those, and we've already mentioned those, the ECTS system and the CLAR system. The virtue of both of these is that neither one requires seat time, neither one requires face-to-face instruction, and they are both widely recognized by governments because they're part of this major global precedent that we have mentioned. The hallmarks of quality, those were also found to be very important because they are modality neutral. The combined factors that I just wanted to mention briefly are benchmarking initiatives to strengthen the quality of online education. The dissertation explores several of those. Those are tools that have been developed outside of Latin America, outside of our schools, but as schools look for ways to strengthen the quality of theological education and theological distance education, these are very valuable. There's the CODE program, the Australasian Council on Open Distance and E-Learning. There's E-Excellence, which is a European quality benchmark for online, open, and flexible education. There's Open Ed, which is a benchmarking best practices system for MOOCs, for massive open online courses. And also the Online Learning Consortium has some very valuable resources, and all of these can be used for free. One more is Pick and Mix. It's a benchmarking initiative that's absolutely free on the internet, and schools can take from this different benchmarks that will be helpful and relevant to their particular situation. So the fifth and the sixth objectives, on the basis of those internal factors that I've mentioned, I wanted to offer some proposals and recommendations to theological schools in Latin America to help them strengthen their online programs. And on the basis of the external factors, I wanted to offer proposals and recommendations for the consideration of private accreditors. And in particular, I've been thinking about ITAL. There is interest within ITAL, interest within ITAL's Accreditation Commission for these types of recommendations. And so I addressed some of the recommendations specifically to ITAL and also to governments. If any government in the region was interested to see or to know more about how online accreditation happens in other parts of the world, some recommendations for them. So recommendations with regards to the first two factors, the educational philosophy and practices and competency-based assessment. I just wanted to urge theological institutions to adapt educational philosophy and practices that are appropriate for online education. And I underscored my conviction of the importance of competency-based education. Number two, the recommendation is that ITAL, in their accreditation standards and in their self-evaluation guide for institutions, that they would really orient their evaluation of program quality around the achievement of learning, not seat time, not other metrics, but learning that can be demonstrated. I mentioned in the third place that I thought it would be good for ITAL and Overseas Council. We cooperate in a lot of things, and I thought that it would be good to work together to train member schools in backwards design and in developing competency-based theological education. A couple of recommendations with regards to the first external factor, cooperative strategies that strengthen the quality of online theological education. I won't repeat them here, but the dissertation gives a list, a series of ideas and recommendations of ways that theological schools in the region could work together to strengthen the quality of their programs through cooperation with other schools, and also working through networks of theological schools like Overseas Council and ITAL. And there's some ideas like the creation of new consortial initiatives, but also participation in existing initiatives, ways that if we weren't so fragmented, if we could, come together in some common understandings, the ways we could share resources, programs, services, and other things. With regards to the second external factor, what accreditation policies would help these programs be accredited, I recommend to ITAL that in our accreditation standards, as we work to revise our standards, that we would incorporate a definition of academic credit that's compatible with distance education, that doesn't presuppose a residential or face-to-face bricks and mortar model, but that can be applied to all sorts of instructional models that would require the same level of quality for all models, but models would be able to demonstrate that quality in ways that are appropriate to their particular context. So I'm recommending a definition of academic credit that's compatible and easy to relate, easy to understand to other systems, like the CLAR system or the ECTS system. And one of the recommendations is that ITAL would adapt the CLAR system, or would at least encourage schools to use both systems and use ITAL's own system, but also to translate that into CLAR terms. The second recommendation is that ITAL would adapt a modality neutral and agnostic posture with regards to instructional models. The same level of quality would be required for all schools, regardless of whether it's a distance model or an online model or a traditional model of instruction. Third is that the accreditation standards and the self-evaluation guide would give specific orientation as to how different types of programs can comply with the accreditation standards. How do those standards apply to different modes of instruction? With regards to the benchmarks, that combined factor, that factor that schools can apply to themselves, but it's not a tool that they necessarily had to generate, internal, external, combined factor. I drew on these quality assurance tools around the world, and I gave a series of recommendations to theological institutions in Latin America, to ICET, to ITAL, and to Overseas Council. One is that theological education institutions would take advantage of these benchmarking initiatives, that they would see in them strategic tools that help them to promote the development, improvement, and quality control of their online programs and of the academic and student services that are associated. In second place, that strategic networks like ITAL and Overseas Council could cooperate in developing and promoting these benchmarking initiatives for online education. A recommendation for ICET, the International Council of Evangelical Theological Education, to which ITAL belongs, would be that ICET could participate as a member of the CHIA International Quality Group, and that ITAL and the other regions of ICET could implement and promote these international standards of quality among their schools. Number four, that ITAL's accreditation standards and self-evaluation guide could be revised to include an explicit policy of best practices for online and distance education, and that this be something that is in line with standards that are recognized in other parts of the world with regards to quality in online and distance education. And finally, that ITAL's standards and self-evaluation guide could apply these criteria to the evaluation and accreditation of programs of distance and online theological education. Something that has not been done until now, and it is the hope that this research and these recommendations could be instrumental in helping that to happen.
Thank you so much, Paul, for a really outstanding presentation. We hugely appreciate you sharing.
Thank you.
Good job, Paul.
Thank you.
Wow, that's great.
Qué alivio, gracias.
¿Cuánto te tomó trabajar esa disertación?
Un rato.
Ah,
Fíjate que cuando estuve en la decanatura tenía la tesis ahí abandonada. Así que ha sido en estos últimos años que retomé y al final pude sacarlo de encima. Pero,
y Pablo, una pregunta, Pablo. ¿Conoces algo de la historia de la acreditación en Haití, cómo nació y el proceso de elaborar los documentos?
un poco, pero supongo que conoces más, ¿verdad?
ahí estás con el gurú.
Sí, sí, sí.
Pues el viejo, estás con el viejo, eso es
El
lo,
viejo canoso.
el viejo canoso. Pero energético. Porque
Bien dicho.
gracias. Fue un proceso interesante y de negociar. Negociar estándares, negociar un sinfín de cosas.
Perhaps English, so Jonathan can learn about that.
Okay. Yeah, so I was involved in the formation, it's 25 years ago, of the ITAL standard. And I was just thinking of your last point about, you know, looking at, in different parts of the world. We did that actually at the time, where we had with Paul Bowers, who had come out of Africa, and ACTI. So we had the ACTI standards, we had the ATA from Asia, we had the Caribbean standards. And so we were negotiating and discussing all of those and trying to somehow gear it for Latin America, and at the same time, not only reflect the realities of Latin America, but also put the standards in such a way that they would challenge improvement and not just reflect the status quo. So there's a history behind that.
When would this have been? In the early 90s?
Early 90s, yeah. And, you know, Gary Williams came in later, but yeah, I was one of the original team members. And then I was the accreditation and ITAL rep for Mexico and Central America for several years. And I traveled up and down the Americas, visiting schools and trying to convince them of the need for it and all the things that go with that. But, you know, maybe when I'm in Guatemala in March, we can have that conversation if you'll be there.
You know, I'm going to be in the States in March, but maybe I'll come see you when you're in the States.
Okay, that'd be good.
Yeah.
It'd be a nice time of year anyway.
Yeah, yeah.
Don't visit me now. It's too cold.
Paul, I want to say to you that might be one of the most polished and expertly prepared and researched presentations that I've ever seen online. So I'm extremely grateful that you would share that with us. Time will be short because there's so many good ideas to discuss here. So let's narrow in really on Paul's specific proposals. And I'd like you all to jump right in. Let's talk about Paul's specific proposals and implementation, how these might actually be concretized. Thank you.
Paul, I have a question. Just because of my own experience with ITAL, are you still wrestling with ITAL in terms of institutional competition and suspicion? You know, you talked about cooperation, and that was one of the things that we always hit up with, because people were suspicious of outsiders coming in and looking at what an institution was doing, especially if it was an institution in the same country. There was a lot of suspicion. So I'm just curious, you know, for all kinds of historical reasons. It's country specific and denominational specific. and cultural specific. Have you bumped into that?
Well, you know, in my relation, in the way that I relate to different schools, I am typically with schools that are willing to engage and cooperate to some degree because they're part of ITAL or because they're part of Overseas Council's network. But I think that we really need to, even among the schools that participate, we really need to continue to grow in that area. And there are other schools that may not participate in those networks just because of that suspicion that you mentioned.
This is Juan Martinez. I was also involved, not with ITAL, but with Liet about the same time as Danny, and in the 1990s. And both the issue of suspicion, but also the issue of questioning the value. Whether in fact, what was the value that the institution was going to gain? Because the value of accreditation is for connections outside, but many of the institutions were not seriously connected outside of their own denominational or church networks, and often wondered what the point was. And in fact, most of the institutions I continue to interact with today would have the question, you know, why would we bother? And how do you address that? Because I was very grateful, though I found it interesting, I'll be honest, that many of these discussions were the same ones, and I think Danny already alluded to that, the same discussions we were having about distance education back when we were looking at manuals and other kinds of things that we were trying to put together. The issues were much the same kinds of issues. And so I'm wondering how that gets addressed. Now, is the answer just to say we'll stay within the networks of people that are interested, or is there a broader answer than that?
That's a question that I'm very much asking myself, and I don't have the answer. As we have related with the regional associations of other parts of the world who are also part of ISET, I've come to realize that ITAL is so far behind with regards to accreditation. If you compare ITAL with 165 schools, but only about 3 accredited schools, with the Asian Theological Association, where almost all of their schools are accredited, I'm still trying to understand, how do you understand that? Is it a cultural thing? Is it because of the requirement of the association that their affiliate schools also be accredited? I think there's several parts to that, but it's something that we urgently need to address in Latin America.
Well, as I was listening to you, I was wondering what the situation is, because even here in the States, there are a lot of institutions offering online programs, but still under the same umbrella of accreditation. So, and I think that is pretty much the case in some institutions in Latin America, with the exception of the programs that are purely online. Having, for example, among the other programs, a master's degree online. So the institutions are still not making any distinction in the accreditation piece. And they are just kind of putting that program, that online program, under the same parameters of the accreditation, whatever the accrediting association is. So did you explore something like that in Latin America, and how that could work? Does that mean they would need a different piece of the accreditation for the online programs? Mm-hmm. Could that be better, keep them combined with non-online and online programs and just get one accreditation for everything? I just was wondering about that, and I don't know how much you have considered that aspect, because I think that is an important aspect for institutions to get to the point that all their programs are online. It's going to take a while.
Mm-hmm. Well, in the States, you're right. A lot of accredited, or a lot of online programs that are accredited are parts of accredited institutions that are traditional residential type models. But the accreditation standards explicitly address quality and online education. with ITAL, the problem is there's not explicit mention of online or distance education. So it really comes down to sort of the way that the Accreditation Commission interprets the standards, because there's nothing explicit there. It comes down to a matter of interpretation. So in the case of SETECA, our school is accredited and we have residential programs, but we also have online programs. And sort of the assumption is that our online programs have been accredited along with the institution. But what about a school like Prometa? Here's Mark and Kike and Keith. Their school is purely online and wouldn't have some of the bricks and mortar aspects that a school like SETECA has. And so I wonder, or I doubt really, that ITAL's accreditation standards as written now would be able to adequately address a school that is virtualized to the extent that Prometa is. So part of the proposal is that we need to make those things explicit, even if there's goodwill and sort of the good intention to take into account these types of programs. We need to show how different models can fulfill and comply with the standard.
If I can jump in here with a little history, the idea of the online really was an issue from the very beginning. So that was a discussion that went on Juan would know this, Juan Martinez. But the thing was that no one knew what to do with it. And so everyone that was working on the standards pretty much was kind of the traditional teacher in a traditional institution. But everyone was aware of these other issues that were just beginning to surface, but no one really knew how to do it. And so what actually happened, and you're actually, the fruit of this, is that for 20 years, the question was, who's going to be able to have the time to sit down and do what you've just done? And at the time, no one had the time. And so that's why that was never addressed. But the inquietud has been there for 25 years, just to let you know. The other thing that was a topic of discussion is the question, what is it that's accredited, the school or the degree? And, when I was at Denver, for instance, that was the discussion, you see. So Denver was giving accredited degrees, but before they could even offer anything online, they would have to run the degree program through the ATS process. And ATS had some standards linked in terms of, for instance, how much a degree, what percentage could be online, things like that. Library resources, availability through internet, things like that. So that's an interesting discussion, is what is it that's accredited, the degree or the institution, and then how do those combine, you see? So like you just gave the example of SETECA. Okay, SETECA may be an accredited institution. The other question is it an accreditable degree within the accredited institution? I mean, that's another discussion.
That's the difference, for example, that I can note between ITAL and, say, the Asian Theological Association. They accredit institutions, but also programs. And that's one of the reasons why there's so many institutions and programs that have achieved accreditation. One thing that is being done right now within ITAL is we're trying to go back and rework, revise, rethink some of the accreditation standards and processes, doing some of the same work that you guys did 20 years ago, just realizing that some of the good decisions that were made 20 years ago are still in place and should be, and there's other things that need to be rethought and contextualized, and our schools are asking for that. And you're right about that sense of there's a debt to our schools, and it's something that has gone unfulfilled for a while. So we hope to be able to grow in that area.
Another thing that was, and Juan, jump in on this one, was one of the reasons that we would talk about accreditation was that some of these schools would want to send their students on for higher degrees outside of Latin America.
Mm-hmm.
And we had to come up with some kind of standards that would be acceptable in the US and Europe. So when you're talking about learning internationally, it's also, and this goes through the US Department of Education and other things like that, was how to set up a degree that would be recognized by, let's say, doctoral programs in the US and in Europe. That was something that was important and which is an ongoing issue. I know here at Wheaton, you know, if a student from overseas applies for the doctoral program and all their learning has been in Africa or Latin America, the question is, you know, how good was that degree? You know, so Kwang, you do this with Fuller. I know you do.
Yeah, well, and part of the bigger part of the question, we do at Fuller and also now IET in the United States is with Spanish language Bible institutes, which are probably the closest to a lot of the kinds of programs that we're talking about in Latin America. Is as long as they're only serving internally, the issues of accreditation aren't issues. But the moment that a group of a percentage of students want to go out beyond, like Danny mentioned. And certainly IET is working with ATS to figure out a way not to accredit the Bible institutes, but to recognize the value of the work that they have done, and so that ATS institutions would know that what a diploma from XYZ Bible Institute meant would be equivalent academically and capacity-wise to enter a master's program at this point. So that becomes another way. If the issue is working with other institutions, those are some of the other ways that are being used to answer that. I think the question continues to be what's the value of accreditation for a specific institution, for the students that value that. I mean, I think that the value of having a common base is important. You know, in other words, if you did this here, you did this there, there's some commonality, there's some academic oomph to what you've done. But the issue is, how do you connect to other places? And that one hasn't been resolved, I think. And I'm not sure how it gets resolved in the Spanish-speaking world. I think even the Portuguese-speaking world, I think in Brazil, which is why, for example, IETAL has so many institutions in Brazil and finds it hard to have institutions in the Spanish-speaking world that are actively working. I think that's because it's also with the other accrediting agencies. Brazil's is very strong, and Spanish-speaking world is they're all over the place.
That's right. And in Latin America, we have that fragmentation between Brazil and the Spanish-speaking countries, and then fragmentation among the Spanish-speaking countries. So.
Paul, first of all, thank you so very much. Your work is outstanding. This is super duper califragilistic, and I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Second thing, can we distribute, or how much can we distribute your thesis, your presentation? Because I think many organizations need to hear this. I represent Trainers of Pastors International Coalition. Most of the organizations that I would represent are non-accredited, and they would be very interested in hearing this. Nevertheless, in Costa Rica, Ecuador, Peru, and other places, I've been in connection with organizations that intend to be accredited, or accredited as CETECA is, not by the government, but have the standards. So the larger question is, how much can we share? How can we share it? And some of the graphs that you have, and I saw the copyright of your thesis. I imagine that we can go back to some of the sources, like Marvin Oxenham competency and other graphs that you've presented that are very useful. So back to you.
You can feel free to distribute that or use it in any way that would be helpful. That's fine. I wrote it intending it to be helpful in our region, and any way that you would find it to be helpful among the schools you represent, feel free to share.
Well,
All
you
right. So copyright means I have the right to copy it as many times as I need, right?
in Latin America, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it's in Spanish, so obviously it wouldn't be. I hope you put some of the stuff in English.
Yeah, there may be some parts of that I may publish later, but any way that you're able to use it, please feel free. Don't worry about the copyright.
Thank you, Paul. I have 16 witnesses. All right.
There they are.
Paul, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, I'm David Ramirez. Do you think that in Latin America, the value of the private accreditation is decreasing and there's more expectation of our students to have a government accreditation? It seems to be that there is an interest and that is a tremendous challenge for all of our nations in Latin America, how difficult it has been to be accredited or recognized by the governments.
David, it's nice to meet you and speak to you in person. I've seen your picture at Semisud, but it's nice to see you and meet you in person. You know, this is a major issue in Latin America. For many of our schools, and more than half of ITAL's affiliate schools are in Brazil, government recognition is the major felt need, it's the urgent requirement. Brazil is one of the best examples of that. Just a few years ago, the government the Ministry of Education rolled out national curricular guidelines, as they had done with other university programs. But they rolled out national curricular guidelines for theology. And the effect of that is that only schools that comply with the competency profiles and with the way that the government says that theology programs should be structured are allowed or permitted by the government to offer, say, a Bachelor of Theology degree, una licenciatura de teología. So you have this major problem and this major debate in Brazil because you have hundreds and hundreds of theological schools that are not either unable or unwilling to pursue that government accreditation, but are legally required to do so. And because the government has regulated theology degrees, all of a sudden Bible schools don't have permission to teach what they teach. And so that's one of the areas that ITAL is seeing the need to, we need to not only promote and offer private accreditation services to our schools, but we also need to be helping schools in Brazil and schools in Colombia and other parts of Latin America where government accreditation is necessary and required to give them guidance and help as they navigate that process that many times can be complicated. You know, how do you comply with the government without, you know, changing the DNA of your school and becoming something that you never intended to become? In Brazil, there's some very good examples of schools that have been able to comply with the government requirement. And those best examples should be shared with other schools who are trying to figure out, well, how do we do this? So David, I think I would agree with your observation. For many schools, private accreditation continues to have a value, but it's not urgent. The urgency is to be able to achieve government recognition and accreditation.
This has been an outstanding conversation. Could I ask folks to try to make an exercise of summarizing the most salient, actionable points?
Well, Paul, I would just commend you. This is the study that ITAL has been wanting for 25 years. So, and you did a superb job. You hit so many things, the history, the international piece. I'm thoroughly impressed. And un fuerte abrazo y un gran aplauso, hermano.
Muchas gracias.
Yeah, you know, it'd be interesting would be, and maybe you've already done this, is because you're at CETECA and CETECA has some international connections up in the U.S., it might be interesting to talk with people up in this country, and even Wilma Ramirez, you know, at Denver, about what's going on, and just spend a couple of days in a couple of different institutions. Maybe you've already done that.
I would welcome that opportunity.
Yeah, I think that would be great. And you have the connections, you know, Wilmer, then you have Kwang, you know, in LA and others. So that would be something that it might give it some extra oomph too, and some, you know, más peso, hermano, you know? So that's just a thought.
Okay, thank you, Danny.
No, thank you, Paul, for the presentation, and I agree with what my colleagues have said about it, and looking forward to seeing how this unpacks in the years ahead. This is going to be a fairly long process. I think one of the takeaways, I think, is an encouragement to those of us who are leading institutions or who have a decision-making influence in the institution to look for ways to join together and cooperate where we can help each other fill in gaps and maybe look for ways to strengthen one another's programs through a consortium or through consortiums or through networks, which is one of the purposes I know of the Aqueduct project in its mission. And so I think that's an area where online education for a number of years has not been viewed the same way it is today. And it has a different status now than it did 20 years ago. And so it's time for us to think cooperatively in terms of consortiums, in terms of partnerships and alliances, to see what we can do to help one another develop a network that is accreditable and is maybe not officially accreditable, but at the standard of accreditation, where we can work together and maintain a high level of quality as we work in these kinds of partnerships. So for me, that's one very important takeaway.
I just wanted to pick up on one point that you put in your final chapter on the conclusions and recommendations, and I fully agree with you that you want to see in an accreditation model a concern for having an integrated orientation that involves the being, knowing, and doing, what we regard as holistic formation that includes not only growth in knowledge and understanding and ability to communicate, but also growth in spiritual formation, character growth, and growth in ministry or practical skills. And I think just a point I'd like to make about that, and here's a great opportunity, I believe, that can bridge a major divide that we have in our theological education world, and that is the divide between the seminary and the church. With online education, you can have two different modes, if you like: blended mode that involves some face-to-face time and some online time, and then you can have fully online education where, as far as the student's concerned, everything is 100% online with respect to the school. But for those schools, how do they do the holistic formation and so on? And I think there's a great opportunity here, and I'd like to see this built into accreditation standards such as in ITAL's and other international agencies' standards. A push, if you like, for a partnership between the seminary and the local church, because these aspects of the holistic formation can take place through the local church relationships, local church mentors, not only local church, it could be parachurch organizations or community organizations where the on-the-ground mentoring can take place. But I think there's a great opportunity here for the accreditation agencies to push for this partnership, particularly as more and more programs go online. And then as they go online, they want to attract students who are in geographically diverse places you've got to then develop some intentionally, and you say this, but the key question is to encourage people, how do you do it? And we've got to think through this issue. So that was the main point I wanted to make, but thank you so much, Paul.
Paul, you have great implications and recommendations, but you also have a 420 pages dissertation. So I would say, by hearing all the really helpful content and information that you have, it could be really helpful taking two things or doing two things. One is trying to write a couple of articles that you could get published in a journal like Kairos Atzeteca that is distributed to so many institutions. But also having those articles available for people who are not subscribed to Kairos, because that you could send those short articles to people and get conversations started upon something that they will have. And I think that could open a great opportunity to discuss all this great work that you have done, and that could be helpful to so many institutions in Latin America and outside Latin America, similar contexts that are working on those aspects and still figuring out how to do. So that could be one thing that I would encourage you to do. And the other thing is what happens sometimes with dissertation work and with these conversations is that we have great ideas, great suggestions come out of these gatherings, but then you don't see much happening after that. I would say if you can target one or two things where you want to start, which was related to conversations, starting conversations, and I think that could kind of start to help moving toward things that we want to do and see, not only from the accrediting associations, but also starting on the institutions and what they can start to do regarding those aspects of online education. Because I think even we are late on coming with all this online education, there are still institutions that are just starting to do that and need a lot of orientation on those aspects. So where do you want to start and when do you want to start? Those could be things that I think are helpful to all of us when we propose these great recommendations and possible ways of work and cooperation and all that. But thank you so much. It's a really nice piece of work that you have done.
Thank you, Orbe. Gracias.
Wonderful. I want to say thank you so much for your expertise and your time. And thank you, Paul, for leading us in our presentation.